Hello everyone, welcome to RS Academy, and this is the very first video of our channel, and I'm going to start with class 11 biology series, and in that under human physiology unit we will be studying chapter 14, breathing and exchange of gases. We will be learning each and every concept in the simple and easiest way. So come, let's get started.
What is breathing? So, breathing is a process by which our body takes in the oxygen and removes carbon dioxide. So, our body needs energy to perform various activities. To obtain that energy, the simple compounds like glucose, amino acids, and fatty acids are indirectly broken down to retrieve energy. And this process is called as catabolic reaction. Okay? And CO2 is also released during this catabolic reaction, and which is the harmful gas. So, oxygen must continuously enter the body and carbon dioxide must be removed from our body. This exchange of gases is called as breathing or respiration. Okay? As I have already told you, O2 is inhaled and CO2 is exhaled. This process is called breathing. And this breathing varies among the different organisms based on their habitats and their level of organizations. Now let us get started with lower invertebrates. Okay, so in lower invertebrates such as sponges, coelenterates and flatworms, all of these performs their respiration through simple diffusion. So this kind of respiration happens directly through their body surface. So O2 is exchanged CO2. And then comes the aquatic arthropods. What does the aquatic arthropods do for breathing? They use their gills or their body surface for breathing. And then comes the earthworm. Earthworm breathes through their moist skin, which allows easy diffusion of gases. And then comes the insects. Insects respire through their network of tubes called tracheal tubes. Okay, tracheal tubes are nothing but the network of tubes which is used for the transportation of gases throughout the body. Okay, and then mollusks. Mollusks breathe through their lungs. These lungs are like vascularized bags and that helps in the inhalation of oxygen and exhalation of carbon dioxide. Okay, now we know what are all the vertebrates, right? Amphibians, aves, reptiles, mammals, all these are called as vertebrates. So first we will be taking example of fish. Fish breathes through their lungs. And then amphibians. Amphibians like frog breathe through their moist skin or lungs and gills at the same time. When does it breathe through their moist skin? While under the water, because amphibians are the living beings who lives in both land and water, right? While living on the land, it will use its lungs. Okay, and then comes reptiles, mammals and birds. And reptiles respire through their lungs and which are more developed than amphibians. Their lungs are more developed than amphibians. And birds possess lungs along with the air sacs. Okay, for what? Which will make their respiration more efficient. Okay, mammals also use highly developed lungs for effective respiration process. Now, let's move on to human respiratory system. So, we all know human respiratory system contains lungs as of now. As I said, the respiration begins with pair of external nostrils, that is nothing but nose. So, nose is the place where the air enters into our body. From nostrils, the air moves to nasal chamber through nasal passage. So, what is nasal chamber? Nasal chamber is a crucial part of the respiratory system that filters, warms the air and humidifies the air, while also it will be responsible for the olfactory receptors function. Okay. So from nasal chamber, the air moves to pharynx. What is pharynx? Pharynx is the common passage for both food and air. And then comes the larynx. So the air travels from pharynx to trachea through larynx. Okay. So what is larynx? Cartilaginous box, and it is also known as sound box, which is responsible for sound production. Okay. And this is how the air reaches trachea. So now we will see what is trachea and other parts of respiratory system. And now what is glottis and what is epiglottis? Okay. So during swallowing, the opening of the larynx called glottis. Glottis is nothing but the opening of larynx. Okay. So that will be covered by epiglottis. So epiglottis is nothing but a leaf-shaped, thin, elastic, cartilaginous flap that prevents the entry of food and liquid into larynx. So glottis will be closed by epiglottis for the prevention of entry of food and liquid into the larynx. Now, what is trachea? Trachea is a straight tube that extends up to the mid-thoracic cavity. So, at the level of fifth thoracic vertebra, the trachea divides into two primary bronchi, that is left and right primary bronchi. And each bronchi undergoes further division and forms secondary and tertiary bronchi and then forms the bronchioles and finally reaches the very thin terminal bronchioles. Okay, the trachea, primary, secondary, tertiary bronchi and initial bronchioles. All of these are supported by cartilaginous ring, which is incomplete. Okay, the cartilaginous ring is incomplete. That cartilaginous ring supports trachea, primary, secondary, tertiary bronchi, initial bronchioles. And then the terminal bronchioles. The terminal bronchioles will be usually very thin and will be in the structure of vascularized bags. So that is called as alveoli. But the bronchioles doesn't directly form alveoli. From bronchioles, the alveolar ducts are formed and from alveolar ducts, alveoli is formed. So the branching process is bronchi, bronchioles, alveolar ducts and then comes the alveoli. So all of these combines and makes what? Lungs. Okay. As we have already studied, the respiratory system begins with the external pair of nostrils, right? So from nostrils, the air travels to nasal chamber through nasal passage and then reaches pharynx and then reaches trachea through larynx. What is larynx? That is the cartilaginous box that is also known as sound box, responsible for sound production. And we have seen trachea. What is trachea? It is extended up to mid-thoracic cavity, that is straight tube. So if you look at here, you will see this is the straight tube that is called as trachea. At the fifth level of thoracic vertebra, divides the two primary bronchi, that is left and right. Okay. So this is the lungs. And now we have seen what is bronchioles. This part is called as bronchioles. And then what is bronchus? Bronchus is nothing but the division of trachea into primary and secondary is called as bronchus. And now what is alveoli? Alveoli are the terminal bronchioles. So now comes the pleural membrane and pleural fluid. Okay. So actually the lungs are surrounded by double layered pleural membrane. And that pleural membrane is actually filled with pleural fluid. So this pleural fluid and pleural membrane is responsible for the reduction of friction. This reduces friction. Okay. Now, what is diaphragm? Diaphragm is the dome-shaped organ which will contract and relax during the breathing process. Okay. And I will tell you where does the contraction happens and where does the diaphragm will get relaxed. We will see through it. Okay. And yeah, epiglottis. That is the leaf-shaped thin cartilaginous flap which we have seen, which is helpful for the prevention of entry of food and air into larynx. Okay. Now, by this, I am concluding the diagram. Okay. I have already told you that the lungs are surrounded by double layered pleural membrane. This and this part. Okay. So, one is outer pleural membrane, another one is inner pleural membrane. Okay. The outer pleural membrane will be close to thoracic lining. This is the outer pleural membrane. And what is inner pleural membrane? Inner pleural membrane is close to the lung surface. So, this is the lungs which is close to the lung surface is inner pleural membrane and the one which is outer will be close to the thoracic lining. Now we have seen what are the parts in the respiratory system, like which starts with external pair of nostrils and continues to nasal passage, nasal chamber, and then reaches pharynx through, and then from pharynx reaches trachea through larynx. Now all of these is a continuous process, and then it reaches bronchi, bronchioles, and alveoli, where the diffusion will happen. All of these are the parts of the respiratory system. Now, the entire respiratory system is actually divided into two parts, that is conducting part and exchange or respiratory part. Now, let's see what is conducting part. Okay. So, what is conducting part? Conducting part starts from the external pair of nostrils and ends at the terminal bronchioles, and not with the alveoli. You have to listen keenly here. Starts with external nostrils and ends at the terminal bronchioles. So, all these parts coming in between the external nostrils to terminal bronchioles are called as conducting part. And then alveoli and its ducts are called as exchange part. The exchange part is the part where the diffusion will happen. Okay, that we will see in the next thing. Now, so while the air moves inside the conducting part, that is external nostrils to nasal chamber to pharynx to trachea. In these parts itself, the air will be humidified, the foreign particles will be removed, and the air will be brought to the body temperature, and that is how humans actually survives the very cold temperature. Okay. Now let us see thoracic chamber. Okay. The human respiratory system is located inside the thoracic chamber, also known as the chest cavity. Thoracic chamber is also known as chest cavity. So, thoracic chamber is the airtight chamber, and this thoracic chamber is dorsally supported by vertebral column. What is dorsal? Dorsal is nothing but backside. Dorsally supported by the vertebral column, ventrally by sternum, and laterally by ribs, and lower side by dome-shaped diaphragm. We have seen in the diagram, right? What is diaphragm? It will contract or relax during the respiration process. It is nothing but the muscle which supports the respiration process. Okay. Now, so whenever the size of the thoracic cavity changes, it will be reflected in the lung cavity also. So the volume of lung will also be changing, because which is very essential for breathing. Volume changes are very important for breathing. Okay. Now let us move on to respiration steps. So, what are the respiration steps? Breathe in, breathe out. So, we can call it as inspiration and expiration. Now, during inspiration, the air inhaled is atmospheric air, and during expiration, the air exhaled out is carbon dioxide. This is the first process, like most basic process of the respiration. Okay. Now, the inhaled air will reach alveoli, which are thin-walled and vascularized bag. We have already studied, right? Which is thin and vascularized in structure, that is called as alveoli. So, here the exchange of gases occur through simple diffusion. So, O2 and CO2 are exchanged by the process called simple diffusion through alveolar membrane. Now, let us move on to respiration steps. We all know the respiration involves inspiration and expiration. This is the most basic process of the respiration process. So, we will be seeing inspiration and expiration in a detailed manner in the upcoming topics. But as of now, we will be seeing the steps alone right now. Okay. Now, what is the air that will be inhaled by the human respiratory system? That is atmospheric air. And what will be exhaled? That is carbon dioxide. And the inhaled air will finally reach the tiny alveoli, tiny sac called alveoli, okay, which is thin and vascularized. So, here the exchange of gases will happen through simple diffusion, where the CO2 and O2 will be exchanged. So, now look on to this. O2 from the alveoli moves to blood, okay, and then while CO2 from blood moves to alveoli. Okay, this is how it happens. And then the transportation of gases by blood. So the blood then transports oxygen to all the body tissues. Inside the tissues, oxygen diffuses from the blood into the cell. Cells utilize oxygen for the cellular respiration, as we have already studied the catabolic reaction, which is responsible for retrieving the energy for the human body. So during this process, CO2 is produced, which is a waste gas, and it will be released out. How it will be released out? It will be released to the blood, and from blood it will be transported to the lungs, and then it will be released out. Okay, O2 is utilized for catabolic reaction. Now let's move on to mechanism of breathing. As I have already said, mechanism of breathing involves inspiration and expiration. What is inspiration? Taking the air into the lungs. What is expiration? Releasing the air out of the lungs. Simple, right? So how does the movement of air takes place in and out of the body? So, movement of air mainly depends on the pressure between the atmosphere and the lungs. So, air will always move from the higher pressure to the lower pressure. Not from lower pressure to higher pressure, it will always move from high to low. So, during inspiration, the atmospheric pressure will be high, then the intrapulmonary pressure. Intrapulmonary pressure is nothing but our lung pressure. Okay, lung pressure should be low than the atmospheric pressure, and in expiration it is vice versa. So the atmospheric pressure should be lower than the intrapulmonary pressure, and that is how the expiration process takes place. Now, what are the muscles that are involved in the respiration process? Two main muscles that are involved in the respiration process. One is diaphragm, another one is intercostal muscles. So what is diaphragm? We have seen the lungs, okay, will be having a dome shaped muscle. Below that, it will contract and relax during the entire respiration process. Okay, and then comes the intercostal muscle. There are two types of intercostal muscle. What are those? Internal and external. Internal helps in the forced expiration and external helps in the inspiration. Okay, now let us see the inspiration process. I have already told you that respiration involves two muscles, that is, one is diaphragm and another one is intercostal muscle. There are two types of intercostal muscles. So, what are those? External intercostal muscle and internal intercostal muscle. So, in inspiration, external intercostal muscles and diaphragm plays a major role. So, diaphragm and external intercostal muscle both gets contracted. So, what happens when diaphragm gets contracted? So, it becomes flat, and when it becomes flat, the thoracic volume will be increased, and external intercostal muscle gets contracted. When the external intercostal muscle gets contracted, the ribs will move upward and outward, and sternum will move forward. Okay, due to these activities, there will be increase in the volume in anterior posterior axis and also ventral axis. Okay, now let us look on to the inspiration process in a flowchart manner. Okay, so I have already told you the diaphragm gets contracted, so thus the thoracic volume gets increased, and then when the thoracic volume gets increased, there will be increase in the lung volume. Okay, and then intrapulmonary pressure should be low. We have already studied that the air will move from higher pressure to lower pressure, so the lung pressure should be less than the atmospheric pressure. Okay, and this is how the air enters the lungs. So thoracic volume should be high, lung volume should be high, and atmospheric pressure should be high. Which is low here? Only the lung pressure. Now let's move on to the expiration process. Okay, so expiration is the passive process and inspiration is the active process. So in inspiration, both diaphragm and external intercostal muscle gets contracted. The same happens vice versa here. In expiration, the diaphragm gets relaxed and also external intercostal muscle gets relaxed. What happens when the diaphragm gets relaxed? The dome-shaped diaphragm will move upward. Okay? And then, what happens when the external intercostal muscle gets relaxed? Ribs and sternum returns back to the normal position. What happened to the ribs and sternum in the inspiration? Ribs will move upward and outward, sternum will move forward, right? So that will be returning to the normal position in expiration. So let's look onto the flow chart. First, there will be decrease in the thoracic cavity volume. In inspiration, the thoracic cavity volume was increased. Here, the thoracic cavity volume should decrease, and the lung volume will also get decreased. When the lung volume and the thoracic cavity volume gets increased, the intrapulmonary pressure, that is our lung pressure, should be increased. So that is how the air moves, right? The inner pressure should be higher than the atmospheric pressure. So air is exhaled out. So now let's see what is forced breathing. Okay. During normal breathing, inspiration mainly occurs due to the contraction of the diaphragm and external intercostal muscles, right? But during the forceful breathing, but mainly during the forceful expiration, abdominal muscles and intercostal muscles helps in pushing the air out of the lungs. So in forced breathing, there will be vigorous muscle contraction. This muscle contraction happens because we are breathing beyond normal. Okay. And forced breathing is an active respiratory process. Now let's see the normal breathing rate. Normally, a healthy adult breathes around 12 to 16 times per minute. Okay. So this is called as the normal breathing rate. And it indicates that our respiratory system is functioning very properly under the resting conditions. And then, now to measure the volume of air that is entering in and out, that is inspired and expired by our lungs, is measured by an instrument called spirometer. So, the process of recording these lung volumes and capacities are known as spirometry. Okay? And it helps in assessing the function and health of the lungs. Let's move on to the respiratory volumes and capacities. First, let us see respiratory volumes. So, respiratory volumes are the individual amount of air involved in breathing. Okay. So, there are 4 types of respiratory volumes. What are all those? Tidal volume, inspiratory reserve volume, expiratory reserve volume, and residual volume. Okay. Now, let's see what is tidal volume. Tidal volume means the volume of air inspired or expired during the normal breathing. Okay, no forceful breathing, no forceful inspiration and expiration. Breathing is normal here. So, the volume of air inspired or expired during the normal breathing. The amount of air that we breathe in or breathe out during one normal breath is called as tidal volume. Okay, and its average value is about 500 ml for one breathing. So, for per minute, it will be around 6,000 to 8,000 ml approximately. And importantly, a healthy person will be breathing for 12 to 16 times per minute, right? So, total air inspired and total air expired per minute is 6,000 to 8,000 ml. Now comes the inspiratory reserve volume. What is inspiratory reserve volume? We take a normal breath. Okay. After taking a normal breath, we inhale forcefully. Okay. The extra amount of air entering the lungs during this forceful inspiration after the normal inspiration is called as inspiratory reserve volume. So, its average value is around 2,500 to 3,000 ml. Okay. Now, what is expiratory reserve volume? The volume of air expired by forceful respiration. So, what is that? After a normal expiration, if we exhale forcefully, the extra amount of air is expelled from our lungs, right? So, that volume is called as expiratory reserve volume. Average is around 1000 to 1100 ml. And then comes the residual volume. Okay. What is residual volume? Even after the forceful expiration, some amount of air will be remaining inside our lungs. So, that remaining air in the lungs is called as residual volume. Okay. Its average value is around 1100 to 1200. So, ERV and RV's values are closely 1000 to 1100 and 1100 to 1200. It is easy to remember, right? ERV and RV will be having the continuous values. And tidal volume for one breath, we are having 500, and for per minute 6,000 to 8,000 ml approximately. And for IRB, it is around 2,500 to 3,000 ml. So these are all the things that you have to keep in mind for sure. Okay. So now let's move on to the pulmonary capacities. There are 5 types of pulmonary capacities: inspiratory capacity, expiratory capacity, functional residual capacity, vital capacity, and total lung capacity. Okay. Now let's see inspiratory capacity. Okay. What is inspiratory capacity? It is the total amount of air a person can inhale after normal expiration. He exhales normally and he inspires maximum amount of air. So this involves normal expiration, that is idle volume, along with the maximum amount of air inspired, that is inspiratory reserve volume. These both together gives us the inspiratory capacity. Okay. And then comes the expiratory capacity. Expiratory capacity is nothing but the total amount of air a person can exhale after a normal inspiration. Here, after normal inspiration, a person has inhaled normally and he is expiring the maximum amount of air. So, here the forceful expiration happens, that is expiratory reserve volume, and normal inspiration, that is tidal volume. Both together gives us the expiratory capacity. And now comes the functional residual capacity. What is functional residual capacity? The amount of air that is remaining in our lungs after the normal expiration. We are expiring normally here. After normal expiration, some amount of air will be residing in our lungs. So, ERV along with the residual volume gives us the functional residual capacity. Okay. And then let's move on to vital capacity. So, vital capacity is the maximum amount of air a person can breathe in after forced expiration and breathe out after forced inspiration. Okay, either this or that. Both are calculated as vital capacity. Okay. So, the maximum amount of air a person can, first he is breathing after the forceful expiration and exhaling after the forceful inspiration. So, here it involves IRB and ERB along with the tidal volume gives us the vital capacity. So, vital capacity indicates the efficiency of lungs. So, vital capacity is very important. Okay. So, next comes the total lung capacity. What is total lung capacity? Total volume of air lungs can hold after forced inspiration. Okay. The total amount of air that is present in our lungs after the forced inspiration. You are inspiring forcefully. That amount of air will be residing in your lungs and that volume is called as total lung capacity. So, the total lung capacity is calculated by inspirated reserve volume, expirated reserve volume along with the tidal volume. And these three makes vital capacity, right? And along with residual volume. So, if you add inspirated reserve volume, expirated reserve volume, tidal volume along with the residual volume, we will be getting the total lung capacity. Okay. So, I have given you a shortcut here to remember all the capacities. I eat fresh vegetables totally. So, I for inspiratory capacity, E for expiratory capacity, F for functional residual capacity. What is V for? V for vital capacity and T for total lung capacity. Okay. Now, shall we recall the formulas of all the capacities because that is very important. Okay. Okay. Now, let us see the formulas of each capacity. I have told you what is inspiration capacity. Inspiration capacity is nothing but the total amount of air a person can inhale after normal expiration. So, inhale after normal expiration. So, IRV along with normal expiration involves tidal volume. And The expiratory capacity is nothing but the total amount of air a person can exhale after a normal inspiration. So this involves ERV along with the tidal volume. And then comes the functional residual capacity. What is the formula of functional residual capacity? The volume of air that is remaining in the lungs after the normal expiration. So that we should have residual volume along with the expiratory reserve volume. Why we are having expiratory reserve volume here? Because after the normal expiration, the amount of air that is remaining in the lungs are residual volume, and the expiration value is expiratory reserve volume. And then let's move to vital capacity. Vital capacity involves a maximum amount of air a person can breathe in after forced expiration. So he is breathing in after the forced expiration. Okay, this involves, what are all the things that is involved in the vital capacity? Inspiratory reserve volume along with the tidal volume and along with the expiratory reserve volume, right? And what makes total lung capacity? Vital capacity along with the residual volume, right? So vital capacity is nothing but inspiratory reserve volume, tidal volume and expiratory reserve volume. And let us recall the values of each volumes that we have read above. Okay. What are the volumes that we have read? Inspiratory reserve volume, expiratory reserve volume, residual volume and tidal volume. Now let us see the value of tidal volume. That is what we have read first, right? So in one breath, a normal person will inhale or exhale 500 ml of air in normal breathing, right? So for per minute, he will be utilizing the air of volume 6000 to 8000 ml. And then comes the inspiratory reserve volume. Inspiratory reserve volume is 2500 to 3000 ml. And what is expiratory reserve volume? Expiratory reserve volume is 1000 to 1100 ml. And what is residual volume? Residual volume is 1100 1200 ml. Thank you students for attending the class and listening till the end. If there are any mistakes in my explanation, please let me know in the comments. And also tell me whether my handwriting was clear and easy to understand. If you have any suggestions or improvements, feel free to share them, okay? I'll definitely work on them. Thank you once again. Bye.